Heart monitors at Mercy General don't beep like in movies. Instead, machines shriek. In this blindingly bright, blood-slicked purgatory, staff turnover remains high. Nobody tracks one quiet night nurse who always handles catastrophic traumas. Nobody asks why she never clocks out. Until an armed Black Ops squad finally arrived, Mercy General Hospital sat on the bruised edge of the city, a concrete monolith that swallowed the broken and spat out the lucky. Inside its emergency department, time didn't exist. There was only the relentless, grinding present. The smell never changed, a heavy, metallic cocktail of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the undeniable copper tang of fresh blood. Working the graveyard shift at Mercy wasn't a job, it was a sentence. You either burned out in 6 months, or you lost whatever soft edges you had and stayed forever. Brenda, the charge nurse, was the latter. She lived on ibuprofen and spite, her eyes perpetually framed by dark, bruised bags. She ran the floor like a drill sergeant because if she didn't, people died. It was that simple. The system was chronically underfunded. They were always short-staffed, always missing linens, always waiting on a doctor who was sleeping in an on-call room 3 floors up. And then there was Nara. Nara was a fixture of the 2 a.m. rush. Brenda couldn't quite remember when Nara had started. Sometime last year. The year before. The hospital used a half-dozen different temp agencies to plug the gaping holes in their schedule, and faces blurred together. But Nara stayed. She was a slight woman, pale to the point of translucence, with hair tied back in a messy, nondescript bun. She wore the standard issue scrub blue, though hers always looked a little faded, a little out of date. Her ID badge was permanently flipped backward, showing only the magnetic strip. Nobody really talked to Nara, and Nara rarely spoke, but she worked. God, she worked. She was always there when a code was called. When the paramedics wheeled in a John Doe, who had been scraped off the interstate, screaming and thrashing, it was Nara who quietly slipped to the head of the bed. She didn't yell for meds. She didn't bark orders. She just placed her hands on the patient. Brenda had noticed it once, during a particularly brutal winter night. A homeless man was brought in, severe hypothermia, crashing hard. The room was a chaotic storm of barking residents and frantic nurses. Nara simply stood by his side, holding his grimy, frostbitten hand. Her lips moved, murmuring something too quiet to hear over the wail of the monitors. And the man had calmed. His violent shivering had subsided into a gentle stillness. "Your hands are freezing!" A young, arrogant, first-year resident had snapped at Nara once, brushing past her to check a central line. "Put some gloves on for Christ's sake!" "Poor circulation," Nara had whispered. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Soft, distant. She didn't use the digital charting system. The administration had rolled out a multi-million-dollar tablet interface that crashed every 3 hours, but Nara never touched it. She preps IVs. She packed wounds with gauze. She cleaned the blood off the linoleum before the janitorial staff even knew there was a spill. The other nurses just assumed she was old school, terrified of the technology, and they were happy to do her charting if it meant she kept taking the worst bedpans and the most violent alcoholics. She was a ghost in the machine, a quiet, efficient cog in a broken wheel. Sometimes, when the floor settled into a rare, breathless lull around 4 a.m., Brenda would look down the long fluorescent hallway and see Nara standing by the double doors of the trauma bay. Just standing there, staring out into the darkness of the ambulance drop-off. She never drank coffee. She never sat in the break room to complain about the administration. She just waited for the next bleeding thing to come through the doors. Brenda didn't ask questions. In a place where death was a daily co-worker, you didn't question a nurse who made the dying go quietly. You just thanked whatever God you believed in, took a sip of your cold coffee, and went to the next room. It happened in November, a Tuesday, the kind of night where the cold outside is sharp enough to crack bone. At 03:15 hours, the hospital was eerily quiet. Brenda was at the nurses' station, fighting a losing battle against a migraine. when the heavy pneumatic doors of the ambulance bay blew open. There were no sirens, no radio call from dispatch, just the screech of tires and the slamming of heavy car doors. A matte black SUV covered in highway salt and mud sat idling directly in the red zone. 4 men spilled out. They weren't paramedics. They wore heavy tactical gear, stripped of any insignia, patches, or name tags. Their faces were smeared with grease and sweat. 2 of them were practically carrying a third, dragging him through the sliding doors. "We need a trauma team, now!" the leader barked. He was a mountain of a man, his voice a jagged edge of pure adrenaline and panic. Let's call him Cole. His hands were clamped desperately over his teammate's thigh. Blood, bright, arterial, frothy blood, was pulsing through Cole's fingers, slicking the hospital floor in heavy crimson droplets. "Bed 4!" Brenda yelled, instantly on her feet, kicking the brake off a gurney. "Get him on the bed! Dr. Evans, get out here!" They hoisted the wounded man onto the gurney. His name was Hollins. He was terrifyingly pale, his lips carrying a faint blue tint. A high-caliber round had shattered his femur and severed the femoral artery. He had minutes, maybe less. Dr. Evans, a third-year resident who had never seen a combat wound in his life, froze. He stared at the sheer volume of blood pooling on the sterile white sheets. We need to clamp it. I need a tourniquet. Get a crash cart." "He's bleeding out, Doc!" yelled another of the men, Morrison slamming his fist against the wall. "Do your damn job!" The room was vibrating with aggression. These were men trained to kill, deeply traumatized, watching their brother drain out onto an emergency room floor. Cole pulled a sidearm from his drop-leg holster, not pointing it at anyone, but holding it in a white-knuckle grip of sheer helpless rage. "Fix him!" Evans was hyperventilating. Brenda was struggling to get a massive transfusion protocol initiated, her hands slipping on the plastic blood bags. Then, the curtain pulled back. Nara stepped into the blinding light of Trauma Bay 4. She didn't look at the guns. She didn't look at the tactical gear or the men screaming. She looked only at the wound. She moved with an unnatural, gliding smoothness. She stepped right beside Cole, gently but firmly pushing his massive, blood-soaked hands out of the way. "Hey, what the hell are you—" Cole started. "Move!" Nara said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the panic like a scalpel. It was a voice that commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. The authority of the grave. Cole stepped back, stunned into compliance. Nara didn't bother with gloves. She plunged her bare hands directly into the ragged, torn flesh of Hollins's thigh. She pushed deep, past the torn muscle, finding the severed end of the artery. She clamped down with her fingers. Instantly, the arterial spurting stopped. "Get the blood in him," Nara told Brenda, not looking up. "Evans, stop shaking. Get your surgical kit. You need to tie this off before transport." Evans blinked, snapping out of his shock, and scrambled for the instruments. Hollins convulsed on the bed, his eyes rolling back. "Cold," he gasped, his voice a wet rattle. "So cold." Cole leaned over his teammate. "Stay with me, buddy. Stay with us." Nara's hands were buried in the wound. Her face was entirely blank, an expression of profound, endless exhaustion. She looked at Hollins, right into his rolling eyes. "You are not leaving yet," she whispered. Cole watched her. He had seen medics work under fire. He had seen the best trauma surgeons in the military operate. But he had never seen anyone like this woman. There was a palpable chill radiating from her. The air in the trauma bay seemed to drop 10 degrees. The metallic smell of blood was suddenly overpowered by the sharp, sterile scent of iodine and something else. Something like dried flowers and dust. "Hold him down," Nara instructed Morrison and the fourth man Briggs. "He's going to seize." He did. As Evans finally managed to get the clamps in place and began the frantic work of suturing the vessel enough for the OR, Hollins thrashed violently. But Nara didn't move. Her hands remained buried in his leg, an immovable anchor holding him to the world of the living. When the attending surgeon finally burst through the doors 10 minutes later, yelling for transport to operating room 2, The chaos resumed. The gurney was unlocked and shoved down the hallway. The Black Ops team followed the bloody trail, entirely focused on their man. An hour later, the adrenaline crashed. Cole sat in the sterile waiting room, his hands still stained rust brown. The surgeon had come out. Hollins was going to make it. It was a miracle he hadn't bled out in the car. Cole stood up and walked back to the ER doors. He found Brenda at the desk, furiously typing up an incident report that carefully omitted the tactical gear and the lack of names. "Excuse me," Cole said, his voice stripped of its earlier aggression. "Just tired." "The nurse, the pale one. Where is she?" Brenda looked up, rubbing her temples. "Nara? Probably in one of the bays." "I need to thank her," Cole said. "She saved his life. The doc froze. She didn't." Brenda sighed, hitting a key on her computer. "I'll let her know. But she doesn't really take visitors. She just works." Cole nodded slowly. He looked down the long fluorescent-lit hallway. It was empty. "Tell her I owe her. Bravo team owes her." He left. The black SUV vanished into the night, as quietly as it had arrived. Brenda went back to her charting. Nara didn't appear for the rest of the shift. Brenda assumed she was hiding in the supply closet, avoiding the paperwork. It was standard Nara behavior. 9 months later, a Tuesday afternoon, the daytime emergency room was a different beast entirely from the graveyard shift. Sunlight filtered through the grimy, reinforced windows. The waiting room was packed with crying toddlers, workers holding lacerated hands in bloody towels, and the constant, dull roar of daytime television. There were hospital administrators walking around in crisp suits holding clipboards, a stark contrast to the feral survivalism of the night shift. Brenda was working a rare day shift, covering for a sick colleague. She was miserable. The daylight hurt her eyes. The sliding glass doors parted and 4 men walked in. They weren't bleeding this time. They wore civilian clothes. Jeans, heavy flannel shirts, dark jackets. But they still moved like a unit, checking the corners of the room instinctively, their posture rigid with ingrained military discipline. It was Cole, Morrison, Briggs, and Hollins. Hollins was walking with a heavy limp, leaning slightly on a dark wood cane, but he was alive. There was colour in his face. They walked directly to the triage desk, bypassing a line of groaning patients. A security guard started to step forward, but Cole shot him a look that stopped the man dead in his tracks. Cole leaned on the high counter. He recognized Brenda immediately, despite the 9 months and the change in lighting. "Ma'am," Cole said politely, "we're looking for someone." Brenda squinted at them. It took her a second to place the broad shoulders and the intense, unblinking stares. Then she remembered the blood, the unmarked SUV, the sheer panic. "You guys," Brenda said, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "You shouldn't be back here. That was an off-the-books drop. I didn't file your names." "We aren't here to cause trouble," Hollins spoke up. His voice was rough. "We came to pay a debt. I spent 3 months in rehab learning how to walk again. I want to see the nurse." "Nara," Cole supplied. Small, pale, quiet, wore faded blue scrubs. "She saved my boy's life. We brought her something." He patted a small rectangular box in his jacket pocket. It was a challenge coin, custom forged, and a deeply personal letter. Men like Cole didn't hand those out lightly. Brenda sighed, pulling up the master schedule on her monitor. "Look, guys, it's 2 p.m. Nara is strictly night shift. She's a vampire. She doesn't come in until midnight, and honestly, she's an agency floater. I don't even know if she's on rotation this week." Cole frowned. "Call her." "I don't have her number," Brenda said, exasperated. "Like I said, she's agency. I don't manage her payroll. I barely manage her existence on the floor." "What agency?" Morrison asked, pulling out a notepad. "We'll go to them." Brenda rubbed her eyes. "Let me look. Hang on." She typed Nara into the hospital's active contractor database. Nothing came up. She frowned. She typed it again. Filtered by nursing staff. Filtered by emergency department. 0 results. "That's weird," Brenda muttered. "Maybe they moved her to the surgical floor." She expanded the search to the entire hospital network. 0 results. Problem? Cole asked, his eyes narrowing. His paranoia was instantly activated. Did the hospital fire her? Did she get into trouble for helping them off the books? I can't find her in the active system, Brenda said, clicking her mouse aggressively. Hey, Dr. Evans! Evans was walking past, carrying a stack of charts. He looked older now, more weathered. He stopped and looked at the men, recognition flashing in his eyes. He visibly tensed. Doc, Cole nodded at him. We're trying to find Nara, the nurse who helped clamp Hollins here. Evans looked confused. Nara, the pale woman? Yeah. I haven't seen her in months, Evans said. I thought she transferred. Honestly, I thought she was fired. She never logged her hours in the digital system. Brenda was annoyed now. She hated when the system proved her right about its incompetence. Hold on. If she's not in the digital system, she has to be in the old paper archives. They haven't digitized the older contractor files yet. She pointed to a bank of grey filing cabinets behind the glass of the administrative office. Give me a minute. The four men stood in silence as Brenda walked into the back office. The ER hummed around them. A child cried. A phone rang. Brenda opened the drawer labelled inactive/terminated staff. A to F. It was a mess of manila folders. She thumbed through the C's, realising she didn't even know Nara's last name. She checked N. Nothing. An older woman, Martha, the hospital's records archivist, was sitting at a desk in the corner, eating a sad-looking sandwich. She watched Brenda digging. Who are you looking for, hun? Martha asked. A temp nurse. Nara. Short, pale, always wears those old 1990s blue scrubs, the ones they phased out. Martha stopped chewing. Her face went entirely slack. Nara? Martha asked, her voice trembling slightly. Yeah, the night shift ghost. Works like a dog, never talks. You know her last name? Martha stood up slowly. She walked over to a different set of cabinets. These were locked. They were the deep archives. She pulled a brass key from her lanyard, opened the drawer, and pulled out a thick, dust-covered red folder. She walked over and handed it to Brenda. Her hands were shaking. Brenda opened it. Clipped to the top left corner of the paperwork was a faded Polaroid ID badge. Nara Collins, registered nurse, emergency department. It was her. The messy bun. The sad, exhausted eyes. Brenda smiled triumphantly. Got her. Nara Collins. I knew she wasn't just a floater. She started to pull the file to take it out to the men. Martha put a hand on Brenda's wrist. Her grip was tight. Brenda, Martha whispered. Look at the date on the termination of employment. Brenda looked down. There was a red stamp across the primary document. Deceased. Date. October 14th, 2020. Brenda's stomach plummeted. The air in the tiny office suddenly felt suffocatingly hot. Martha, what is this? I worked with her. I worked with her last month. Martha shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. You couldn't have. Nara Collins was the charge nurse in the East Wing, 6 years ago, before they tore it down. There was a ruptured gas line in the basement during a mass casualty event. She was in Trauma Bay 4. She refused to evacuate because she was doing chest compressions on a kid. Brenda couldn't breathe. The ringing in her ears drowned out the sounds of the hospital. No. She held the flashlight for me while I intubated a guy in February. She clamped an artery for those men out there 9 months ago. Brenda, Martha said softly. They pulled her body out of the rubble. I went to her funeral. Brenda turned slowly, looking through the glass window of the office. Out in the waiting area, Cole, Hollins, Morrison, and Briggs were standing patiently. Giant, dangerous men who had survived war zones, waiting to give a medal to a woman who had been dead for 6 years. Brenda held the red folder to her chest. Her hands were shaking now. She walked out of the office, the short journey feeling like a march across the bottom of the ocean. She stopped in front of Cole. She didn't say a word. She just opened the folder and turned it around so they could see the Polaroid. Is this her? Brenda choked out. Cole smiled, relief washing over his hardened face. Yeah, that's her. Where is she? Hollins leaned forward to look at the picture. His eyes tracked down the page. He stopped. The colour that had returned to his face drained away instantly, leaving him just as pale as the night he had bled on the floor. "Cole," Hollins whispered. "Look at the stamp." Cole looked. The 4 men, killers and survivors, men who didn't believe in anything they couldn't shoot or bandage, stared at the red ink. "Deceased, 6 years ago." "That's a mistake," Cole said, his voice hard, but carrying a tremor he couldn't hide. "I touched her. She pushed me out of the way. She clamped his leg." "Hollins," Morrison said quietly, looking at his teammate. "When she touched you, what did you say?" Hollins swallowed hard, his hands gripping his cane until his knuckles turned white. "I said she was cold. She felt like ice." The bustling emergency room moved around them, doctors shouting, machines shrieking, life and death fighting their endless war. But in that small circle by the triage desk, the world had entirely stopped. Part 4. The night shift lingers. Cole stared at the stamp. The red ink was dry, cracked with age. Deceased. 6 years ago. He didn't drop his stoic facade, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. Morrison took a slow step backward, physically putting distance between himself and the manila folder, as if the paper itself were radioactive. Briggs crossed his heavy arms over his chest, his eyes darting toward the busy trauma bays down the hall, scanning for a threat that didn't exist in any physical dimension. "That's impossible," Briggs muttered. The word sounded hollow. Brenda slowly lowered the file. Her hands were numb. The chaotic noise of the daytime ER, the crying infants, the clattering metal trays, the monotone paging system, faded into a distant, underwater hum. She thought about the winter nights. She thought about the homeless man with hypothermia. She had watched Nara hold his hand. She had seen the physical depression of the mattress under Nara's weight. What kind of ghost leaves footprints in the blood on the floor? Brenda thought, her mind spiraling. What kind of ghost restocks the gauze? Martha, the archivist, stepped out of her small office. She looked at the 4 massive, imposing men. She saw the heavy wood cane in Hollins' grip. She saw the profound existential shock vibrating through them. "She was a good nurse," Martha said quietly. Her voice grounded them. It cut through the rising panic. "The best we had. When the gas main ruptured in the basement back in 2020, it took out the foundational supports under the east wing. It happened fast. 1 second the lights flickered. The next, the floor just dropped." Martha crossed her arms, shivering despite the stale, warm air of the hospital. The evacuation alarm sounded 3 minutes before the collapse. Everyone ran. The doctors, the techs, but Nara had a 12-year-old girl on the table in Bay 4. Asthma attack that triggered sudden cardiac arrest. Nara was doing chest compressions. Hollins leaned heavily on his cane. He was staring at his own leg. "She didn't leave." "She didn't leave," Martha confirmed. "A resident told us later. He was running for the double doors, screaming at Nara to follow. He said she didn't even look up. She just kept the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, keeping the blood moving to the kid's brain. The ceiling came down a minute later. It took them 2 days to dig her out." Martha paused, wiping a stray tear from her wrinkled cheek. "The girl died too. They found Nara curled over her, protecting her from the cinder blocks. It didn't work, but she tried." Silence settled over the group. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. These were men who understood sacrifice. They had buried brothers in closed caskets. They understood the grim, brutal arithmetic of staying behind so someone else could live. They didn't understand the supernatural, but they understood duty. "I felt her," Hollins whispered. His voice was raw. He looked up at Cole, his eyes wide, stripped of their usual cynical armor. "Cole, man, I felt her hands. When she dug into my leg, it wasn't just cold. It was heavy. It hurt. She physically clamped the artery. My blood was on her scrubs." "I know," Cole said. He turned to Brenda. His dark eyes were burning with an intensity that made her want to step back. "You work with her. You've seen her." I thought she was an agency temp," Brenda stammered, feeling sick to her stomach. The guilt was sudden and overwhelming. She had yelled at Nara. She had snapped at her to clean up spilled iodine. She had left the hardest, most ungrateful tasks to a woman who was already dead. She never spoke. She just took the worst cases, the ones nobody else wanted, the ones that were bleeding out. She just showed up around 2 a.m. and left before dawn. Because she's still on shift, Morrison said. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked down the hallway toward the swinging doors of the trauma bays. She never clocked out. We owe her, Cole said. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute certainty in his tone brooked no argument. He reached into his heavy jacket and pulled out the small, black rectangular box. He opened it. Inside sat a heavy, custom-minted challenge coin. It was matte black with silver edges. On one side was the insignia of their Tier 1 unit, a spear breaking a chain. On the other, deeply engraved, was the date they had brought Hollins in. The date Nara had saved him. Beneath the date was a single word. Always. I don't care if she's dead, Cole said, snapping the box shut. A debt is a debt. Where is Trauma Bay 4? You can't go back there, Brenda said, her professional instincts warring with the sheer surreal terror of the moment. It's an active floor. We rebuilt Bay 4 over the exact footprint of the old one. It's sterile. You guys are... We aren't leaving, Cole interrupted. He didn't threaten her. He just stated a geographic fact. They were going to stay in this hospital until the debt was paid. Brenda looked at the clock. It was 3:15 p.m. She only comes out at night, Brenda said. Her throat felt tight. Between midnight and 4, when it gets bad. Cole nodded once. Then we wait. They retreated to the corner of the waiting room. They didn't look at their phones. They didn't read the outdated magazines. They sat with military stillness, 4 sentinels in a sea of civilian misery, waiting for the sun to go down. Brenda finished her shift at 7 p.m. She was supposed to go home. Her apartment was a 20-minute drive away. Her cat needed feeding. Her bed was calling her name. Instead, she went to her locker, splashed freezing water on her face, and walked to the charge nurse desk. She told the night shift supervisor she was pulling a double. She couldn't leave. Not tonight. Part 5. The challenge coin. Midnight arrived with a bitter, biting chill that seeped through the reinforced glass of the ambulance bay. The hospital underwent its nightly metamorphosis. The administrators vanished. The crying children were replaced by the victims of the city's darker hours. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows against the scuffed linoleum. Brenda stood at the triage desk. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but adrenaline kept her heart hammering against her ribs. Every time the pneumatic doors hissed open, her breath hitched. At 1:30 a.m., Cole walked up to the desk. The rest of his team remained in the waiting room. Hollins was sitting stiffly, massaging his bad leg. Is she here? Cole asked quietly. I don't know, Brenda admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. She doesn't clock in. She just appears. Usually when we're going under, when the board is full and we're losing someone. Cole looked past her, staring down the long, empty corridor that led to Trauma Bay 4. The room was currently empty, the lights dimmed. The sterile instruments lay neatly on their metal trays, gleaming in the shadows. Let me in there, Cole said. Brenda hesitated. Protocol screamed at her to call security. But security couldn't stop the men who had carried a bleeding comrade through those doors 9 months ago. And protocol didn't cover phantoms who saved lives. She nodded. She walked out from behind the desk, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking faintly on the floor. Cole followed her. They stepped into Trauma Bay 4. It was freezing. Brenda wrapped her arms around herself. It was always cold in Bay 4, a long-standing complaint among the nursing staff that facilities management blamed on a faulty HVAC duct. Now Brenda knew better. It was a cold that settled deep in the marrow. It smelled faintly of iodine and dust. Cole walked over to the stainless steel counter beside the primary gurney. He moved with deliberate, heavy reverence. He pulled the small black box from his pocket. He took the coin out, setting the heavy metal carefully on the sterile steel. He pulled a folded piece of heavy cardstock from his jacket, a letter he had written by hand, detailing exactly what Hollins meant to him and what she had done for their family. He placed the letter beneath the coin. He took a step back. He didn't say a prayer. He wasn't a religious man. "Thank you, Nara," Cole said. His deep voice resonated off the tiled walls. "From Bravo, you ever need us, you make the call. We'll find a way." He turned and walked out of the bay. Brenda followed, pulling the glass door shut behind them. The silence lasted exactly 14 minutes. At 1:44 a.m., the radio on Brenda's hip crackled to life with a violent burst of static. "Mercy General, this is Rescue 47. We are 2 minutes out. Incoming trauma, priority 1. 16-year-old male, multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, tachycardic, hypotensive. He's crashing. We are bagging him. Need a full team standing by." The ER erupted. "Trauma 4, Brenda yelled, her exhaustion evaporating instantly. "Get Evans! Get the massive transfusion protocol going, now!" The doors blew open. The paramedics sprinted through, pushing the gurney so hard the wheels sparked against the doorframe. Blood was everywhere. It was a chaotic mirror image of the night Hollins had arrived. The teenager on the gurney was grey. His chest was a ruin of torn tissue and bubbling blood. The monitors screamed the moment they hooked him up. The jagged lines on the screen spiked and plummeted, desperately fighting a losing battle against gravity and fluid loss. Dr. Evans burst into the room, snapping gloves onto his hands. "He's tensioning. Hand me a 14-gauge needle. I need to decompress his chest. Brenda, push epi." It was a bloodbath. They were losing him. The kid's blood pressure was tanking, the numbers dropping so fast they blurred on the digital display. Out in the hallway, pressed against the glass, stood Cole, Hollins, Morrison, and Briggs. They didn't interfere. They watched the grim choreography of the trauma bay, the frantic fight to keep a soul tethered to a broken body. Brenda was covered in blood. She reached for the suction catheter, her hands shaking. The kid's pulse was thready, a faint flutter of a dying bird. "We're going to lose him," Brenda thought, despair threatening to choke her. "He's too far gone." Then, the temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was an instant, violent freeze. The breath plumed from Dr. Evans's mouth in a white cloud. The frantic, metallic tang of fresh blood was suddenly overpowered by the sharp, undeniable scent of old iodine and crushed concrete. Brenda froze. Standing on the opposite side of the gurney, perfectly positioned between the IV poles and the crashing monitor, was Nara. She looked exactly as she always did. The faded 1990s blue scrubs, the messy bun, the pale, translucent skin, her ID badge flipped backward. But this time, Brenda saw the details. She saw the fine layer of grey dust clinging to Nara's shoulders. She saw the dark, bruised exhaustion in her eyes, an exhaustion that went deeper than bone, an exhaustion of the soul. Nobody else in the room seemed to notice her. Dr. Evans was screaming for more suction. A young tech was frantically bagging the patient. Nara didn't look at them. She looked only at the boy on the table. She reached out. Her hands, pale and slender, passed straight through the tangle of plastic IV tubing. She placed her palms flat against the boy's ruined chest. She leaned her weight forward. 1, 2, 3, 4. She was doing compressions, but she wasn't moving the physical muscle. She was pushing something else back into the boy. Brenda watched in stunned, terrified awe. Every time Nara pushed down, a faint, rippling distortion warped the air around her hands, like heat rising off a summer highway. On the screen, the plummeting numbers halted. The jagged red line of the boy's heartbeat, which had been flattening out into the final, fatal hum of a systole, suddenly jerked upward. It spiked, a strong, rhythmic beat. "I got a pulse!" Dr. Evans yelled, shock colouring his voice. "Blood pressure is stabilising. Clamp that bleeder. We have a window. Get him to the OR. Go, go, go." The chaotic knot of medical staff untangled, grabbing the gurney and violently shoving it toward the double doors. They blew past Brenda, sprinting toward the surgical elevators. In seconds, Trauma Bay 4 was empty, save for Brenda. And Nara! The ghost stood by the empty space where the gurney had been. Her shoulders slumped. The air in the room was still freezing. Brenda couldn't breathe. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But she forced herself to stand her ground. She looked at the woman she had worked beside for 2 years. "Nara," Brenda whispered. Her voice broke. Nara turned her head, slowly. For the first time in 2 years, Nara met Brenda's eyes directly. Her eyes were impossibly dark, filled with the weight of 1,000 dying breaths. But there was no malice in them. There was only a profound, lonely dedication. Nara raised a hand, pointing a single pale finger toward the stainless steel counter. Then, like smoke caught in a draught, she blurred. The edges of her faded blue scrubs washed out into the sterile white light of the room. The smell of iodine faded. The temperature in the room slammed back to normal. A wave of suffocating heat hitting Brenda's face. She was gone. Brenda let out a ragged gasp, dropping her bloody gloves onto the floor. Her knees shook so violently she had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. The heavy glass door slid open. Cole stepped into the room. Hollins limped in right behind him, followed by Morrison and Briggs. They had seen the kid stabilize. They had seen the impossible spike on the monitor. They looked at Brenda. Brenda looked at the counter. The Black Ops team walked over to the stainless steel tray. The heavy cardstock letter remained exactly where Cole had placed it. But the black and silver challenge coin was gone. Cole stared at the empty space on the paper. He reached out slowly, his massive hand trembling just a fraction of an inch. He picked up the letter. Right in the center of the heavy paper, over the spot where the coin had rested, was a perfect, distinct fingerprint. It was stamped in wet, rust-brown iodine. Cole traced his thumb in the air above the fingerprint, not daring to touch it. A slow, deeply reverent smile broke across his scarred face. "She accepted it," Cole whispered. Behind him, Hollins let out a sharp breath. He dropped his heavy wooden cane. It clattered loudly against the linoleum. Morrison jumped. "Hollins, you good?" Hollins was staring down at his right leg. The leg that had been shattered. The leg that had burned with phantom cold and deep, agonizing pain every single day for 9 months. He took a step forward, without the cane. He didn't wince. He put his full weight on the foot. "It's warm," Hollins choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He looked at the empty space in the room. "She let me go. It's warm." The monitors in the room were silent. The long, brutal night of Mercy General Hospital raged on in the hallways outside, a never-ending war of flesh and trauma. But inside Trauma Bay 4, there was peace. Brenda walked over to the counter. She picked up a sterile wipe and began to clean the blood off the floor, wiping away the violent mess of the living. She didn't complain. She didn't feel the crushing exhaustion anymore. She knew she wasn't working alone. If you felt the chill of the graveyard shift and loved this story, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Share this with a friend who loves gritty, emotional ghost stories. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping, original tales. Drop a comment below. Would you have realized Nara was a ghost? See you in the next video.